So I have been reading this book. It's called Armenian Golgotha by Grigoris Balakian. Mr. Balakian was an Armenian priest who survived the Ottoman orchestrated Armenian genocide. And it is a horrifying book filled with very, very disturbing details. And Mr. Balakian gets into his life before the Armenian genocide. He actually talks about his life before the outbreak of World War I. He lived in Germany. And he was living in Berlin. He was studying theology. He was trying to better his knowledge in theology. So he was studying at this seminary in Berlin, and he was connected to the patriarchate back in Constantinople. He was under the Armenian patriarchate, which was headquartered back in Constantinople. But here he was in Berlin studying theology, and he talks about the culture of Germany, and he talks about how Germany had this very vibrant culture. And the way he describes Germany, I mean, Germany sounds very, very normal. It doesn't sound like how some people may think it was before World War One. Maybe some people think that before the outbreak of World War One, Germany was just this crazy place riddled with a bunch of hardcore nationalist fanatics, and there were those. But from the way he describes Germany before the outbreak of World War One, life was very, very normal. People went to cafes, people went to restaurants. He talks about how the restaurants would be packed full of people, the cafes were packed full of people. He talks about this one cafe in particular that was popular amongst tourists and how a lot of people would go there and how it was packed full of customers. And then the war gets declared. And here was the Kaiser Wilhelm II, and he does this big, grand speech in Berlin, and Grigoris Balakian was a witness to this speech. He talks about how you could see thousands upon thousands of Germans gathered together just to hear the Kaiser, Caesar of Germany. I mean, Kaiser means Caesar. When you have a German leader calling himself Kaiser, I am Kaiser, I'm Caesar, that's basically saying, I am the new Roman emperor. I am the continuation of Rome. And so there was the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, and he comes on stage, and he has a sword in his hand, and he says, I have wanted peace, but my enemies want war, and here is my sword unsheathed, and my sword will remain unsheathed until my enemies are vanquished. And the whole crowd goes wild. The entire crowd goes into hysterics. They become hysterical. And Mr. Balakian says that you could hear these Germans singing very, very loudly, Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles. And there was this energy, there was this wave of zeal for Germany, this wave of ultra-nationalism, and it was just absolutely uncontrollable. And it was utterly crazy. It was. And people were just going into this frenzy for a war with Russia. And Mr. Balakian talks about how there were all these Germans who were saying things like, oh, well, if we don't stop the Russians now, they're going to invade us. They're going to invade Germany. And he talks about how there were these propagandists for war and how they would say things like this. If we don't stop the Russians now, well, they're going to invade the rest of Europe and they're going to invade Germany. So we must stop the Russians. And all of these young men were in this state of zeal for joining the military. They became zealots for German militarism. And they were lining up by the droves to join the military and to enlist. And he talks about how there was this professor who was a very well-known professor, and he was going to do a lecture. And so all of these young German students come together in his lecture hall, and they're there to hear this professor. But before the professor can begin his lecture on whatever subject he was specialized in, I'm not sure what it was. It could have been physics or something like that. But before this guy begins his lecture, before this professor begins his lecture, he starts exhorting the young men to join the military and fight in the war against Russia. And he says, this is a great war, and this will be a valorous and glorious war. Young men, go fight for Deutschland. And Mr. Balakian talks about how the whole crowd in this lecture hall just went absolutely nuts. And after the professor gives this grand old charismatic speech, he starts beginning his lecture on whatever it was, physics or whatever, and people didn't give a damn about the lecture because all the young men could think about was joining the military. And so they were excited about war, they were zealots about war, but they had never really experienced war. But they thought that war would be something exciting. And so they joined the military, and they went into the trenches, and they got slaughtered by the millions. And I was watching this movie last night, a German movie that someone on this channel recommended to me. I think it's called All Quiet on the Western Front. It's a film that came out a few years ago. I want to make sure I get the name. Yeah, All Quiet on the Western Front. And I was watching this movie, and I was just in shock as to how good this movie was done. This film was so well made. So well made. All Quiet on the Western Front. It's a German movie about World War I. Now, I saw 1917 some years ago, and that was a film about World War I. It's a story that takes place in World War I. Very well done movie. Very well done film. I forget who directs it. I'm not sure. I think it was Nolan. I don't remember the director of that film. But 1917 was a great film. It's a story that takes place in World War I. But All Quiet on the Western Front, by far, this has to be the best damn movie on World War I that has ever been made. It is so good, and it is such an immersive experience. This movie is so immersive, and the film has these long battle scenes, and they are extremely violent, horrifying, harrowing, bloody, intense, and they are realistic. And I was just amazed at how realistic this movie was. In fact, in the beginning of the film, it shows all of these young German men who are students, and they are just giddy about joining the military. They want to join the military, and there's this one young man who wants to join the military to fight the French and the Russians, to fight the enemies of Deutschland. But his mother doesn't want to let him join the military. And she says, no, I don't want you joining the army. You'll die. You won't make it, son. And so this young man goes to his friends, and his friends say, hey, are you going to join the military with us and get into the trenches with us and fight the enemies of Deutschland in a glorious and valorous war? And the young man says, well, my mother doesn't want me to go, and she doesn't want to let me go. And these young men say, oh, you're just so tied up with your mom. You're controlled by your mother. And so there's this peer pressure to join the military. And this young man wants to. It's not like he's using his mother's objection as an excuse. No, he really, really wants to join the army and to go fight the enemies of Deutschland. And he's giddy. And he finally disobeys his mother. He joins the military. He enlists. And he is excited. And all these young men are excited. And they hear from some military leader this speech about fighting the enemy and yada, yada, yada. Or, yeah, they hear this speech about fighting in the military, and they get all giddy about it. And there's this scene in the film that is something straight out of Balakian's book and what he recounts as to what he saw when he was living in Germany before the fighting in World War I commenced. There's this scene in the film where a German professor is giving a speech to his students, and the young men are in the lecture hall, and he's giving off this huge, grand old speech about joining the army, fighting in this glorious war. Of course, he's not going to fight in the war, but he's talking about how it's going to be this glorious war for the survival of the Volk and Deutschland, etc., etc. And all the young men in this lecture hall go crazy. And I'm watching this movie, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, this is exactly what Balakian describes in his book. It's almost like they read Balakian and then they reenacted it into a scene in a movie. And so the young men are excited. They join. They get the uniforms. They go through some training, and then boom, they're in Flanders somewhere. and they're in this trench, and there's explosions everywhere, and people are just dying left, right, and center. And the young man goes through, he goes through this horrifying experience, learning, and really, what his mother warned him, about, just takes over his mind. And he realizes in this movie, going through all of this horror, oh my God, my mother was right. Oh my goodness, mom was right. War is pointless. And it's just death, killing, 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 and it never stops. And this is the horror of mankind's existence. It's just this cycle of war, peace, war, peace, war, peace. And you have one generation that goes through horrific war. They go through tremendous amounts of war, and they realize it's good for nothing. It's not good for anything. It's just human beings murdering each other on some field somewhere. And meanwhile, all these industrialists are making money from the war. They're making money by selling tanks and weapons and helmets and uniforms and et cetera, whatever you need, ammunition, cannons, tanks, whatever you need for war. All these people are making money on the deaths of millions and millions of young men. And that's war. War is the greatest crime ever. It is. There is no crime greater than war. It is the greatest crime ever. You provoke another country to go to war, or you just start a war out of nowhere. You make up propaganda to justify the war, and then you deceive an entire generation of young men to join the war. And you give these young men all these ideas of vainglory and valor and honor and courage. And these are ideas that really appeal to young men, because young men want to prove themselves all the time. As a young man, that's all you want to do is prove yourself. You want to prove that you're strong. You want to prove that you're brave. You want to prove that you are not afraid of anyone. You want to prove that you're tough. And so in this film, this behavior is clearly exhibited. This young man says in the movie, well, I joined the army so that I can prove to others that I'm strong. And it was all this peer pressure. And that peer pressure is really fuel to get people to join the military. And they did this during the Iraq War. They did this sort of thing during the Iraq War. I remember when I was in high school, they had all these recruitment stands, and these soldiers would come to the high school and try to convince these young men to enlist and go to Iraq or go to Afghanistan. And I remember there was this soldier, and he was standing in our school, and he was trying to convince young men to join the military. And he said, well, we pay for your education and blah, blah, blah. And they'll just say anything to you to convince you to join the military. And so you have these ginormous wars that happen, and thousands of young men die, or even millions of young men die. And that was the case of World War I and World War II. And it's just the greatest crime ever. It is. And Mr. Balakian talks about how there was all this zeal, and all these young men joined the German military. And so they went to the trenches, right? They went to the war. And at first, there was all this excitement in the air. And Balakian talks about how there was all this nationalism, and there was all this patriotism, and there was all this energy in the air, right? There was all this energy and excitement for Germany, and the propagandists in Germany were lying to the people. They were saying things like, well, this war will be easy, and we will easily defeat the Russians, and we will easily defeat the French, and in this much time, we will be in Paris. Our soldiers will be marching through Paris. This is the lie that they were telling people in Germany, that this war was going to be a piece of cake. And it wasn't. And Germany was losing the war. And so at first there was all this excitement and energy in the air. There was all this exuberance for war. And then Germany began to lose the war. The British entered the conflict. And that was a big, big hit on the Germans, and that caused a lot of losses. But not only that, Balakian recounts how when the Germans were invading France, the Russians decided to invade East Prussia. They said, okay, well, the Germans are invading France, we're going to invade them. And so the Russians invaded East Prussia, and the Germans said, oh my gosh, the Russians are invading East Prussia. We got to go. And so they forced the Germans to spread themselves out too thinly. And Germany was greatly weakened, and Germany was losing the war tremendously. And there were countless casualties. Tons of people were killed. And so Balakian talks about how once you had all these high casualties, the energy in the air began to decline. And there was this atmosphere of gloominess that filled the air of Germany. And everywhere you went in Berlin, there was gloominess. And the restaurants were no longer packed. And the cafes were no longer packed. And he said before, you could go into a cafe and it was filled with people, but then you went to a cafe and there were just a few people there, and all these restaurants began to lose business, and then they began to do massive layoffs. They had to fire all these workers, and a lot of these restaurant staff members were women, and they were single mothers, and they had all these children to take care of, and their husbands were fighting in the war, or their husbands were dead. And so you had all these single mothers, and they had to take care of kids on their own, and then they were being fired from their jobs, and it was just miserable, just miserable. And he talks about how you could go to the streets of Berlin and all of a sudden you would see these women working as prostitutes on the streets of Berlin. And these were not women who wanted to be prostitutes. These were not women who wanted to be escorts or anything like that. No. These were women who, in utter desperation, became prostitutes because they got fired from their jobs, their husbands were in the war, or their husbands were dead, and they had all these kids to take care of. Nobody wanted to hire them, and so they resorted to prostitution. And it was such a depressing scene. The whole vibe in Germany was depressing. And he talks about how you could see these prostitutes, and then all of a sudden you would see these Germans coming saying, what are you doing? Prostituting your bodies on the streets like this. This is shameful. It's a shame to see the women of Germany acting in this way. And so these German people would take these German prostitutes, and they would cover them up, and they would take them to these charity houses that would take care of these women and make sure that they had something to eat and something to feed their children. And so you had these charities, and Balakian talks about how Germany was a very religious country. There was a lot of religion. There was a lot of conservatism. And so when the Germans saw their women prostituting themselves, they were absolutely enraged. And it really does give you a different perspective on the whole situation, because people talk about post-World War I Germany, and they say that there was all this moral decay, and there was. But then you read about Germany during World War I, and Balakian is writing about how people were really religious, and people were really conservative, and people were so enraged upon seeing German women prostituting themselves that they made sure that these women had a way to feed their kids so that they wouldn't have to prostitute themselves. So there was this, it's a really big shift. It's a really big fall from Germany of World War I to post-World War I Germany. There was this huge decline in morals that happened after World War I. So Balakian, he talks about how just Germany began to change, and there was all these there were all these women being fired, and there was just so much gloominess and depression in the air. And then he talks about how there began this hatred towards Russians in Germany, because there were a lot of Russians who were living in Germany, and the German people began to despise them because they were in the middle of a war with the Russians. And so here was Grigoris Balakian. He's this Armenian Orthodox priest, and he could easily pass as a Russian. I don't know if you guys could see that well, but this guy could easily, the camera I think is mirrored, but this guy could easily pass as a Russian. And so some people thought that he was a Russian Orthodox priest, and there was this one incident where he went to a cafe, and there was a whole bunch of Germans who said, "Russian, are you Russian? Are you Russian?" And the police had to get involved. And so he said, well, the Ottoman Empire and Germany are allies, and they are right now in a war against the Russians and the British. And so he thought, I think it's time for me to go back to Turkey, to go back to the Ottoman Empire, because that's where he was originally from. He was originally from the Ottoman Empire. He was Armenian, but he was a subject of the Ottoman Empire, and so he decided to go back to Constantinople to help his people. This is what he says: I decided to help my people, the Armenians, because in the middle of a war, you don't know what bad things can happen to you. So he went back to Constantinople, and there was all of this hatred against Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. And he felt it when he was there. And that hatred stemmed from this idea that the Armenians could not be trusted, that the Armenians were pro-Russia, which was true to a great extent. A lot of Armenians were pro-Russia. But you could totally understand why the Armenians were pro-Russia, because the Ottomans were persecutors. The Ottoman Empire persecuted the Armenians, and the Russians wanted to help the Armenians. And the Armenians believed that the Russians could create an independent Armenian state. And the Ottomans knew this. And the Ottomans knew that the Russians wanted to use the Armenians as a proxy against the Ottoman Empire. Because the Russians, they would do this thing to the Ottoman Empire where they would support a Christian minority within the Ottoman Empire, and then they would support that people's war for independence, create a state, help them to create a state, and that would reduce the size of the Ottoman Empire. This is what happened, for example, with the Serbs. The Serbs were under Ottoman occupation for half a millennium, for 500 years. The Serbs were under Ottoman occupation, and the Serbs wanted to have their own state. Well, who helped them? The Russians. And this is the reason why the Serbs today are extremely pro-Russia. Serbs are the most pro-Russia people in the world. They are. They are the most pro-Russia people. They are more pro-Russia than the Russians. And if you go back into history, you can read about this war that happened. It was called the Russo-Turkish War from 1877 to 1878. And what happened in that war was that the Russians and the Serbs were allies in a war against the Ottomans. The Russians defeated the Ottomans, and then there was this negotiation that took place in this event called the Congress of Berlin. And in the Congress of Berlin, the Russians said to the Ottomans, we want an independent Serbian state. That's it. That's one of our demands. You have to make this demand. You have to fulfill our demand. An independent Serbian state. And it happened. And the Serbs got their state. That made the Ottoman Empire smaller. So the Russians reduced the size of the Ottoman Empire. And that made the Russians more powerful, because now the Russians had a proxy in the Balkans. And this pissed off the Austrians, because the Austrians have always wanted to control the Balkans. The Austro-Hungarian Empire wanted to control the Balkans. And the last thing they wanted was an independent Serbian state within the Balkans that was a proxy of the Russians. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire preferred that the Ottomans would control the Balkans to keep the Russians out of that southeastern European region. So the last major Christian minority that was living in the Ottoman Empire was the Armenians. There were some Greeks, there were some Assyrians who were living in the Ottoman Empire, but the biggest Christian minority, the last biggest Christian minority in the Ottoman Empire, were the Armenians. And so the Russians were eyeing the Armenians. The Armenians were very, very enthusiastic about this idea of having an independent Armenian state. And if the Armenians were to get their independent state, that would mean carving out more Ottoman territory, reducing the size of the Ottoman Empire, and making Russia more powerful, because that would mean another ally for the Russians against Russia's enemies. And so the Ottomans knew this, and they said, okay, well, what are we going to do? And the Germans were very concerned about this, because the Germans were very anti-Russia, and you can still see this anti-Russian sentiment today. And that's why you see the Germans today talking about how they want to spend hundreds of billions of euros on their military to make their military strong again against the Russians. So this feeling still lingers in the air. And so the Germans, they're looking at the Russians and they're saying, okay, we know what you Russians want to do. You Russians want to form an independent Armenian state that would further carve out more territory from the Ottoman Empire, that would reduce the size of the Ottoman Empire, that would make the Russians more powerful, and thus that would weaken our own geopolitical sphere in the Middle East. And so the Germans were also very interested in this whole situation, in this whole contention between the Ottomans and the Armenians. And before the outbreak of World War I, we're talking about 5 months or so before the outbreak of World War I, the Germans had a meeting with the Ottomans. And in this meeting, the Germans presented a plan to do a complete and utter expulsion of the Armenians from their territories, from their lands, to weaken the Armenians and really to remove the entire cause of Armenian independence. And the Ottomans liked this idea, but the Ottomans wanted to take it a step further and to just exterminate all the Armenians. And the Germans agreed with this idea. And the Germans really backed this idea. And the Germans watched as the Ottomans exterminated the Armenians. And the official policy of the German state was do not get involved, do not intervene to help any Armenians, because we must exterminate these friends of Russia. Because by exterminating a friend of Russia, we weaken the Russians and we strengthen our Ottoman ally. This was the official policy of the Germans. And Grigoris Balakian was in Constantinople when the genocide began. And he was amongst the first victims of the policy of purging out the Armenians. The policy of removing the Armenians did not begin with killing. The policy of removing the Armenians began with deportations. And it began with the deportation of Armenian intellectuals in Constantinople. So the name of this book is Armenian Golgotha. Well, Golgotha was this hill that looked like a skull upon which Jesus Christ was crucified. Jesus Christ was crucified on this hill called Golgotha. Golgotha means, I think it means the mountain of the skull, because it looked like a skull. And what Balakian is doing in this book is he is comparing the plight and the genocide of the Armenians to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And you could say, well, that's blasphemous. It's not, actually. It's not blasphemous. Because what does Jesus Christ say in the Gospels? He says, I was hungry and you did not feed me. I was naked, you did not clothe me. I was in prison, you did not visit me. And the people in the day of judgment will say, Lord, when were you hungry? When were you naked? When were you in prison? And Jesus said, get away from me, I never knew you. And then he tells another people, I was naked, you gave me clothing. I was hungry, you fed me. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. And what was he talking about? He was talking about the persecution of the church, the persecution of the Christians, and how those who did not care about the persecution of God's church never knew God. And Christ tells them, I never knew you. So Christ identifies himself with his persecuted flock. And this is why Balakian compares the genocide of the Armenians to the crucifixion of Christ. And here was Grigoris Balakian in Constantinople, and the Ottoman authorities start rounding up all of the Armenian intellectuals. If you were an intellectual, if you were a philosopher, if you were an activist, if you were a revolutionary, if you were an Armenian who was outspoken about the formation of an independent Armenian state, you were definitely getting arrested. If you were a religious scholar, more than likely, you were going to get arrested. And so Grigoris Balakian was not exempt from this, and he was arrested. And so he talks about how they were rounding up all the Armenians, him included, and how they put him and all these Armenian intellectuals in a train. And he says, we were in this train, and it's such a gloomy picture. When you read what Balakian wrote, it's a very gloomy description. He says, we were all in this train, and it was nighttime. And he says, it was dark outside, and it was dark inside the train, but it was also dark inside of our hearts. And Balakian, you can tell by his style that he was a very mild-mannered man, very mild-mannered, very vulnerable person. He doesn't say, and I haven't finished the book, but from what I've read so far, he never says, oh, I was courageous. Oh, I wanted to die for Christ. Oh, I was so brave. I was fearless. I did not fear my persecutors. No, no, no. Throughout the whole time, and this is so far in the book, throughout this whole time, he's describing how terrified he was. He's describing how he was just filled with gloominess and sadness. And the thing is that when him and these intellectuals were in captivity, they weren't being told what was going to happen to them. They just left these people in limbo. They put them in a train, and then they put them on a boat, and the whole time they weren't telling them what was going to happen to them. They weren't telling them, yeah, we're going to kill you, we're going to deport you, nothing. So they left these Armenians in suspense, and they were in this state of terror because they didn't know what was going to happen to them. And so one day, Grigoris Balakian was with this friend of his, and this friend of his was an Armenian professor. And this professor friend of his said, well, one of my former students is in this area. Because they put him on a train, and they put him on a boat, and then eventually they put him on this carriage. And they took them through the countryside of the Ottoman Empire. And eventually they took them to this town where they allowed them some freedom to move around. Of course, they were under armed guard, they were under watch, but they were allowed to move around here and there. And so this Armenian professor tells Mr. Balakian, one of my former students is in this area. I can go talk to him because he is now this major official in the Ottoman Empire. I can go talk to him and ask him, what the hell are we doing here? Why in the hell are they keeping us like this? What's going to happen to us? I'm going to ask him this question. And Balakian says, well, that's a waste of time. He's not going to tell you, blah, blah, blah. And he says, no. This man was a student of mine. He will explain to us what's happening. He will explain to us what the hell is happening to us. So they go to this Ottoman official, and this Armenian professor says, hey, I was your teacher. And he says, of course, I remember you. I was a student of yours, et cetera, et cetera. And this Ottoman official says, okay, so what can I do for you guys? And this professor says, what the hell are we doing here? Why are we here? Why did we get arrested? Why are we being deported? Why did they put us in a train? Why are they doing this to us? And this professor says, a great storm is coming to the Armenians. And the professor says, what are you talking about? What do you mean? And he says, you guys are smart. You guys are intelligent men. You'll figure it out. And he says, no, I don't know what you're talking about. What are we doing here? And this Ottoman official says, well, he laughs, actually. He laughs, and then he takes this message, he takes this piece of paper out, and he shows it to the professor, his former professor. And on this piece of paper is an official declaration calling for the genocide of the Armenians. It's an official order from the Ottoman government to exterminate the Armenians. And the professor was shocked. And he was in denial. He actually didn't believe that this was going to happen. And this Ottoman official says, they're going to kill the Armenians. They're going to butcher your people. And this official says, I'm going to retire. Because if the Ottomans lose this war, there's going to be trials for those involved in the genocide of the Armenians, and they'll hang me. And he says, all of the pashas who have orchestrated this genocide, Talat Pasha, the pashas, Jamal Pasha, they're going to escape, he says. They're all going to escape. And they're going to put on trial the lower officials of the Ottoman Empire, and they're going to hang us. That's if the Ottomans lose this war. So Mr. Balakian got the message that a genocide was being done. So during this journey, during this deportation that this priest is going through, he meets this little girl. And this little girl is by herself. She has no one with her. No one. No one with her. No family, no parents, no siblings. And Mr. Balakian says, well, what happened to you? And this little girl explains to Father Balakian what happened. And she says, well, they took my mother and my sibling, and they took all of us from our village, and they brought us to this wilderness. And she says that all of a sudden we were surrounded by all of these men, and they had axes and blades and rocks, and she says they began to slaughter all of us. And she says that the children could be heard screaming, "Mother, mother," and their mothers were being butchered. And she said, they left me for dead. They butchered all the rest of us, but they left me for dead. They thought that I was dead. And she says, I woke up and it was nighttime, and I wake up and around me are all of these corpses, all of these chopped up corpses. And so she got up and she was frantically looking for her mother. Where is my mother? Where is my mother? And she eventually found her mother. And I think she lied down next to the corpse of her mother, and eventually she was discovered by some Kurdish cowherders. And the Kurdish cowherders picked her up and they took her to their father and they helped her out. And eventually she made it out. And she met up with Grigoris Balakian, and she recounted to Mr. Balakian this story. And you read these stories, and there's so many stories like this in the Armenian genocide. So much killing. And you read these stories of massacres and butchery, and you realize there is no depth of evil that mankind will not spiral down to. There is no depth of evil that mankind will not go to. And that's the history of mankind. There are glimmers of hope in the history of mankind. There are these moments of humanity, but for much of mankind's history, there is war and war and war and war. And it just doesn't stop. And today I was looking at footage from Syria, and you see these videos of just dead bodies, the corpses of Alawites butchered by these Sunni terrorists who are ruling Syria as proxies of NATO, as proxies of Turkey. And you look at these videos and you see just dead bodies and people screaming and people crying, and it's a nightmare. But the thing is that we do not care enough about human life. We don't. We do not care enough about human life, because if we did, then we wouldn't be supporting these governments that enable such crimes to take place. The policy of NATO was to support an Islamist revolution in Syria. And the Islamist revolution eventually won. And Mr. Bashar al-Assad was overthrown in Syria. And then a bunch of terrorists took over. And the West was celebrating. And what is the result? Butchery. Mass murder, massacres, people being butchered because of their religion, people being murdered because they're Christian or because they're Shia, because they're Alawite. And the West celebrated when these fanatics, these proxies of NATO took over Syria. They said, oh, this is great. This is a great day for democracy. Great day for democracy. We don't care enough about human life. We support these fanatics to take over Syria, and these fanatics do a massacre. They butcher people. We don't care. NATO backs Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan goes to war with the Armenians, massacres Armenians in war crimes, and we will still say that Azerbaijan is a very important ally in the Transcaucasus. And here you have Israel supporting Azerbaijan, but at the same time, Israel still talks about the Holocaust, yet they will support Azerbaijan. And they were supporting Azerbaijan when Azerbaijan was doing horrendous war crimes in Nagorno-Karabakh against Armenian civilians. We don't care about human life. Human life is the least of our concerns. And in this movie that I saw, All Quiet on the Western Front, there are these scenes in the film where you see just bodies. You'll see these strews of dead bodies, corpses on the battlefield. And then you'll see these German military fanatics, and you see the German leadership arguing about whether or not they should surrender, because Germany at this point is losing the war. Germany's soldiers are being butchered on the battlefields with the French and with the British and with the Russians. And you have people who are prudent enough to say, okay, Germany is losing the war. We're not going to win. And you have 40,000 men being killed in just one battle, and it's an absolute nightmare. And for how long are we going to just allow this war to continue on and allow all these young men to be butchered by the droves? And so in this film, there's one German official who wants to surrender because he said, what's the point? What's the point of pushing all these young men to their deaths? What's the point of just throwing these young men into this ginormous meat grinder? What is the point? But then you have this militarist, and his name is, I think his name was von Hindenburg. Was it von Hindenburg? Yes, Paul von Hindenburg. And Paul von Hindenburg is this fanatical German militarist who refuses to surrender. And he's told all these young German men are being killed. All these young Germans are being butchered because you want this war to continue on. And he is so adamant about continuing the war. And there's a scene in the film where Paul von Hindenburg says, well, we're losing this war because of the Social Democrats and it's the liberals. And if you read about the history of what happened after World War I, the Jews got a lot of the blame for that. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of the Germans started to hate the Jews. And that's one of the reasons why they supported Adolf Hitler, because they believed that the Jews were behind Germany's loss. And you look at the whole situation and you say to yourself, no, the reason why you are losing the war is because you're facing all of these European powers at the same time. And you're facing all of the might of the United States all at the same time. You're facing the Russians, the British, the French, and the Americans all at the same time. Of course, you're going to lose. Of course you're going to lose. But this guy doesn't care. He does not give a damn that so many tens of thousands of young men are being butchered in the trenches, being slaughtered in this giant meat grinder of a war. He doesn't care. He wants to continue the war. And that guy, Hindenburg, he would eventually support Adolf Hitler because he wanted the continuation of the war. He believed that Germany was stolen of its victory, that Germany's victory was robbed by the liberals or by the Social Democrats, by the Jews, etc., etc. And so he wanted a fanatic to run Germany, to bring Germany back to the warpath. And Hindenburg supported Adolf Hitler. And it wasn't just Hindenburg. There were other major German militarists who were still angered about Germany's surrender in World War I, who supported Adolf Hitler. And you had people like Erich Ludendorff. Erich Ludendorff was another German militarist from World War I who was angered by Germany's surrender, and he wanted Germany to go back to the warpath, and so he supported Adolf Hitler. And you have these fanatics. That's what happened. And those fanatics just wanted to go back to war, and they didn't give a damn about German life. They didn't give a damn about millions of Germans being butchered in war, or German women being widows and forced into a life of prostitution. They didn't give a damn. All they cared about was their legacy as militarists and as military leaders and as patriots. And that's the thing. You have these militarists, you have these ideologues who push for militarism, and they push for war, and they push for nationalism, and they take nationalism and they mix it with militarism, because you can't have one without the other. Let's be real here. Nationalism is the spiritual foundation for militarism, because no one's just going to get up and fight for a flag. No one's just going to get up and fight for, the defense of democracy. No one really gives a shit about democracy anymore. You have to give someone nationalism. You have to give a people something to fight for that's outside of themselves. And so you have these militarists and these nationalists, and they want war. And they don't care about the loss of life. And they'll tell young men, go fight for your country. It's so glorious. It's so valorous. And young men fall for it, not realizing that the last thing on these militarist people's minds is human life. It is human life that is the resource that is needed the most for war. It is human life that is needed to have a military economy, to have a war machine, to have a country. But it is human life that is cared about the least. Human life is the least of these people's concerns. And so you can go into a war and fight and die, and the people that push you into these wars, the people that use these axioms and these adages of nationalism and valor and glory and patriotism don't give a damn about your life. They just care about their own legacy and their own aura or their own prestige, their own power. Human life is the least thing that is cared about. And people fall for the trick all the time. They fall for nationalism. They fall for militarism. In fact, I was watching this conservative guy recently. His name is Schellenberg. I think he's friends with Jordan Peterson. And there is Schellenberg talking about the AfD and how great it is that the AfD is so popular in Germany, et cetera, et cetera. And he's saying, oh, the AfD is actually anti-war and they're anti-militarism. And I'm thinking, this guy is either naive or he's a liar. Because when you read about the German nationalists today, the big German nationalist party today, the AfD, it is the most militarist party in all of Germany. And you have people spreading this lie, oh, that it's actually anti-war and it's the most pro-peace party in Germany. Bullshit. All bullshit. It's the most pro-militarist party in Germany. Read their policy for Germany's military. They want to create a massive German military that would lead a pan-European force. They basically want to make a Nazi version of the EU because they're Nazis. I mean, their big leader, Bjorn Holke, has been confirmed to be a Nazi. And they want Germany to have nukes. So they want to create this revived German Reich that will have this massive military that will lead the militaries of Europe and that'll have nuclear bombs. And you have people saying, oh, actually, they're the pro-peace party. They're the anti-war party. That is bullshit. That's complete bullshit. But people fall for the deception. They fall for the nationalism. They fall for parties like AfD, not knowing that these people would lead them right into a giant meat grinder. Not knowing that these cults of personality would lead them right into the slaughter. People fall for it. And people look to the Ottoman Empire and they say, oh, the Ottoman Empire was great, or they'll fall for the propaganda and say that the Armenian genocide didn't happen or whatever. And you go back to history and you read about the Armenian genocide. And you'll read about how there are literally thousands of documents talking about the Armenian genocide. It's undeniable. But go back to that history and see what Turkish nationalism did. See what evils Turkish nationalism, with its amalgamation between racism, nationalism, and Islamism, did, and how it played a role in justifying the Armenian genocide. And how the Turks talked about how the Armenians were the inferior people, how they were not Ottomanizing, therefore they were a threat to the Turkish race, and how the Turkish race has a right to slaughter the Armenians because in the law of Darwin, in the law of survival of the fittest, the strong wipe out the weak. And so the Ottoman annihilation of the Armenians was an evidence that the Armenians were weak, and in the law of survival of the fittest, the weak get wiped out. And so in that period, in that time period of World War I and World War II, you saw this hysteria of nationalism, and you see how much bloodshed that led to. And you see how nationalism was used to justify mass murder. And people today still fall for it. People today are still falling for nationalism, not caring about the history, not caring to even look into how nationalism was used to justify so much death, so much murder, genocide, so much bloodshed. People don't care. You know why? Because we don't give a damn about human life. Because if we did, we would not be supporting the revival of these insidious ideologies. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.